In this lecture, we will focus on the broad topic of nations, nation-states, and post-colonialism. The lecture will again be structured around two main questions in relation to a host of core readings on the subject. These questions are, 1, what does imagination have to do with nationhood? And 2, what does it mean to conceptualize nationness and nationalism as modular? The core readings which we will review in order to bring these questions into focus include, first and foremost, perhaps, Benedict Anderson's by now canonical Imagined Communities, first published in 1983, later expanded in 1991, and again republished in 2006 by his brother's publishing company, Verso. We will then turn to consider some of the more influential post-colonial comments on and critiques of Anderson's classic texts, including Homi Bhabha's rather dense but most suggestive 1990 essay, Dissemination, Time, Narrative, and the Margins of the Modern Nation, Dipesh Chakrabarty's nuanced account of nation and imagination in his critically acclaimed book, Provincializing Europe, first published in 2000, and Partha Chatterjee's provocative chapter, Whose Imagined Community, in his 1993 book, The Nation and Its Fragments. We will next consider the critique and adaptation of Anderson's conception of the modularity of the nation form as articulated by Manu Goswami in her path-breaking article from 2002, Rethinking the Modular Nation Form towards a socio-historical conception of nationalism. We will conclude with the consideration of Anne McClintock's feminist rejoinder to the rather masculinist discourse characteristic of most of the literature on nationalism, her critique of the absence of attention to the ways in which the nation form is gendered in her thoughtful chapter, No Longer in a Future Heaven, Nationalism, Gender, and Race, from her 1995 book, Imperial Leather, Race, Gender, and Sexuality in the Colonial Context. The nation as an imagined community. Let us begin with an overview of the main arguments advanced in the most influential book on nationalism of the last generation, Benedict Anderson's magisterial Imagined Communities. In the book, Anderson contends that nationalism is best understood as a deeply ingrained cultural system rather than a mere ideology. In his words, it would, I think, make things easier if one treated it as if it belonged with kinship and religion rather than with liberalism or fascism. Accordingly, in an anthropological spirit, he goes on to propose the following definition of the nation. It is an imagined political community, and imagined as both inherently limited and sovereign. Anderson objects to Ernest Gellner's ferocious claim that nationalism is not the awakening of nations to self-consciousness, it invents nations where they do not exist, thereby contrasting invention with imagination. According to Anderson, the drawback of Gellner's formulation is that he is so anxious to show that nationalism masquerades under false pretenses that he assimilates invention to fabrication and falsity rather than to imagining and creation. In this way, Anderson insists, Gellner implies that true communities exist which can be advantageously juxtaposed to nations. In fact, Anderson contends, all communities larger than primordial villages of face-to-face contact, and perhaps even these, are imagined. As such, Anderson concludes, communities are to be distinguished not by their falsity or genuineness, but by the style in which they are imagined. The basic style of the nation's imagining is threefold. First, it is imagined as limited. Second, it is imagined as sovereign. And third, it is imagined as a community. The nation is imagined as limited, Anderson argues, because even the largest of them, encompassing perhaps 1 billion living human beings, has finite, if elastic, boundaries beyond which lie other nations. Moreover, it is imagined as sovereign, Anderson continues, because the concept was born in an age in which enlightenment and revolution were destroying the legitimacy of the divinely ordained, hierarchical, dynastic realm. Finally, it is imagined as a community, Anderson posits, because regardless of the actual inequality and exploitation that may prevail in each, the nation is always conceived as a deep, horizontal comradeship. Anderson's proposal is, in sum, that nationalism has to be understood by aligning it not with self-consciously held political ideologies, but with the large cultural systems that preceded it, out of which, as well as against which, it came into being. In this vein, he contrasts the nation to the cultural systems of the religious community and the dynastic realm. Anderson emphasizes the importance of the rise of the vernacular languages in Europe in the process of emergence of the preconditions for national consciousness. According to him, the fall of Latin exemplified a larger process in which the sacred communities integrated by old sacred languages were gradually fragmented, pluralized, and territorialized. Likewise, Anderson contrasts the cultural system of the dynastic realm to that of the nation. In his words, kingship organizes everything around a high center. Its legitimacy derives from divinity, not from populations, who after all are subjects, not citizens. In the modern conception, state sovereignty is fully, flatly, and evenly operative over each square centimeter of a legally demarcated territory. But in the older imagining, where states were defined by centers, borders were porous and indistinct, and sovereignties faded imperceptibly into one another. Hence, paradoxically enough, the ease with which pre-modern empires and kingdoms were able to sustain their rule over immensely heterogeneous and often not even contiguous populations for long periods of time. Crucial to Anderson's account of this new form of national imagining is the role of a new conception of time, of temporality, what Anderson calls, following Walter Benjamin, homogeneous empty time. Anderson explains, our own conception of simultaneity has been a long time in the making, and its emergence is certainly connected in ways that have yet to be well studied with the development of the secular sciences. He goes on to stress, but it is a conception of such fundamental importance that without taking it fully into account, we will find it difficult to probe the obscure genesis of nationalism. To this end, Anderson draws a contrast between medieval conceptions of time, characterized by notions of prefigurement and fulfillment, in which simultaneity was imagined as happening a long time, to the new conception of simultaneity as temporal coincidence. As he puts it, what has come to take the place of the medieval conception of simultaneity a long time is, to borrow from Benjamin, an idea of homogeneous empty time, in which simultaneity is, as it were, transverse, cross-time, marked not by prefiguring and fulfillment, but by temporal coincidence and measured by clock and calendar. This point about homogeneous empty time is for Anderson essential. Indeed, he stresses that so deep-lying is this new idea that one could argue that every essential modern conception is based on a conception of meanwhile. The new notion of homogeneous empty time is exemplified for Anderson by the literary forms of the novel and the newspaper. According to Anderson, the structure of the old-fashioned novel, a structure typical not only of the masterpieces of Balzac, but also of contemporary dollar dreadful, of any contemporary dollar dreadful, is clearly a device for the presentation of simultaneity in homogeneous empty time, or a complex gloss upon the word meanwhile. Moreover, Anderson goes on to insist, the idea of a sociological organism moving calendrically through homogeneous empty time is a precise analog of the idea of the nation, which also is conceived as a solid community moving steadily down or up history. The contrast between the temporal presuppositions of the plotline of a novel and the organization of previous literary genres help Anderson drive home his point. He contends, nothing better shows the immersion of the novel in homogeneous empty time than the absence of those prefatory genealogies often ascending to the origin of man, which are so characteristic a feature of ancient chronicles, legends, and holy books. Likewise with the newspaper, Anderson here emphasizes the date at the top of the newspaper, the single most important emblem on it, provides the essential connection, the steady onward clocking of homogeneous empty time. Within that time, the world ambles sturdily ahead. The emergence of a new concept of simultaneity, so crucial for the birth of national consciousness, Anderson attributes, among other causes, to the impact of European incursions overseas and the encounter with radically different civilizations. Along these lines, Anderson insists, in the course of the 16th century, Europe's discovery of grandiose civilizations hitherto only dimly rumored in China, Japan, Southeast Asia, and the Indian subcontinent, or completely unknown, Aztec Mexico and Incan Peru, suggested an irremediable human pluralism. Most of these civilizations had developed quite separate from the known history of Europe, Christendom, antiquity, indeed man. Their genealogies lay outside of and were unassimilable to Eden, to which he adds parenthetically, only homogeneous empty time would offer them accommodation. So-called discovery and conquest, in turn, led to a revolution in European ideas about languages, with social discoveries leading to scientific advances of a sort. For example, advances in semitics, which undermined the idea that Hebrew was either uniquely ancient or of divine provenance. Once again, Anderson concludes, genealogies were being conceived which could only be accommodated by homogeneous, empty time. The next step in Anderson's argument is to link the diffusion of the new conception of temporality to the processes of print capitalism. According to Anderson, the slow, uneven decline of interlinked certainties, first in Western Europe, later elsewhere, under the impact of economic change, discoveries, social and scientific, and the development of increasingly rapid communications drove a harsh wedge between cosmology and history. No surprise then, he contends, that the search was on, so to speak, for a new way of linking fraternity, power, and time meaningfully together, which brings him to this crucial point. Nothing perhaps more precipitated this search, nor made it more fruitful than print capitalism, which made it possible for rapidly growing numbers of people to think about themselves and to relate themselves to others in profoundly new ways. Likewise, he poses the question, if the development of print as commodity is the key to the generation of wholly new ideas of simultaneity, still, we are simply at the point where communities of the type horizontal, secular, transverse time become possible. Why within that type did the nation become so popular? To which he answers, the factors involved are obviously complex and various, but a strong case can be made for the primacy of capitalism. Anderson emphasizes that in preprint Europe, and of course elsewhere in the world, the diversity of spoken languages, those languages that for their speakers were and are the warp and woof of their lives, was immense. So immense indeed that had print capitalism sought to exploit each potential oral vernacular market, it would have remained a capitalism of petty proportions. But these varied idiolects were capable of being assembled within definite limits into print languages far fewer in number. The very arbitrariness of any system of signs for sounds facilitated the assembling process. Not only did print capitalism give a new fixity to language, which in the long run helped to build that image of antiquity so central to the subjective idea of the nation, so too did it create languages of power of a kind different from the older administrative vernaculars. Certain dialects inevitably were closer to each print language and dominated their final forms. Their disadvantaged cousins, still assimilable to the emerging print language, lost caste, above all because they were unsuccessful, or only relatively successful, in insisting on their own print form. Linked to the role of print capitalism is the rise of commercial and industrial bourgeoisies. As Anderson contends, if the expansion of bureaucratic middle classes was a relatively even phenomenon, occurring at comparable rates in both advanced and backward states of Europe, the rise of commercial and industrial bourgeoisies was of course highly uneven, massive and rapid in some places, slow and stunted in others. Even so, he insists, but no matter where this rise has to be understood in its relationship to vernacular print capitalism. This lies in stark contrast to pre-bourgeois ruling classes, who generated their cohesions in some sense outside language, or at least outside print language, in which solidarities were the products of kinship, clientship, and personal loyalties. According to Anderson, the relatively small size of traditional aristocracies, their fixed political bases, and the personalization of political relations implied by sexual intercourse and inheritance meant that their cohesions as classes were as much concrete as imagined. As a result, an illiterate nobility could still act as a nobility. Not so with the bourgeoisie. Here was a class, claims Anderson, which figuratively speaking came into being as a class only in so many replications. Factory owner in Lille was connected to factory owner in Lyon only by reverberation. They had no necessary reason to know of one another's existence. They did not typically marry each other's daughters or inherit each other's property, but they did come to visualize in a general way the existence of thousands and thousands like themselves through print language. For an illiterate bourgeoisie is scarcely imaginable. Thus, Anderson concludes, in world historical terms, bourgeoisies were the first classes to achieve solidarities on an essentially imagined basis. But in 19th century Europe, in which Latin had been defeated by vernacular print capitalism for something like 2 centuries, these solidarities had an outermost stretch limited by vernacular legibilities. In a nutshell, for Anderson, the emergence of homogeneous empty time, this new synchronic novelty, could only come about historically when substantial groups of people were in a position to think of themselves as living lives parallel to those of other substantial groups of people, if never meeting, yet certainly proceeding along the same trajectory. Between 1500 and 1800, an accumulation of technological innovations in the fields of shipbuilding, navigation, horology, and cartography, mediated through print capitalism, was making this type of imagining possible. It became conceivable to dwell on the Peruvian Altiplano, on the pampas of Argentina, or by the harbors of New England, and yet feel connected to certain regions or communities thousands of miles away in England or the Iberian Peninsula. Which brings us to the last step in Anderson's argument. If the nation as an imagined community, one imagined as limited and sovereign, could only arise with the hegemony of homogeneous empty time, and this in turn was diffused and mediated through the processes of print capitalism, with the spread of these temporal conceptions and print capitalist processes came the modular transposition of the nation form. In a word, Anderson emphasizes the modularity of the nation form. He partially breaks with a long Eurocentric tradition by locating the origins of the nation not with the French Revolution, but with the Creole revolutions in the Americas, which were, he insists, national independence movements. The nation form was then transposed and adapted in the wave of popular linguistic nationalisms that spread across Europe in the first half of the 19th century. It was subsequently transposed and adapted again by British and Russian empires' versions of late 19th century official nationalism. And finally, it was transposed and adapted yet again across the colonized world in a last wave peaking in the middle of the 20th century. As such, Anderson argues that the creation of the nation towards the end of the 18th century was the spontaneous distillation of a complex crossing of discrete historical forces, but that once created, it became modular, capable of being transplanted with varying degrees of self-consciousness to a great variety of social terrains, to merge and demerge with a correspondingly wide variety of political and ideological constellations. For example, he contends that the key to situating official nationalism, willed merger of nation and dynastic empire, is to remember that it developed after and in reaction to the popular national movements proliferating in Europe since the 1820s. If these nationalisms were modeled on American and French histories, so now they became modular in turn. It was only that a certain inventive legerdemain was required to permit the empire to appear attractive in national drag. Likewise with the last wave. According to Anderson, the new states of the post-World War II period have their own character, which nonetheless is incomprehensible except in terms of the succession of models we have been considering. One way of underlying this ancestry is to remind ourselves that a very large number of these, mainly non-European nations, came to have European languages of state. If they resembled the American model in this respect, they took from linguistic European nationalism its ardent populism, and from official nationalism its Russifying policy orientation. They did so, he contends, because Americans and Europeans had lived through complex historical experiences which were now everywhere modularly imagined, and because the European languages of state they employed were the legacy of imperialist official nationalism. This is why so often in the nation-building policies of the new states, one sees both a genuine popular nationalist enthusiasm and a systematic, even Machiavellian, instilling of nationalist ideology through the mass media, the educational system, administrative regulations, and so forth. In turn, he continues, this blend of popular and official nationalism has been the product of anomalies created by European imperialism. The well-known arbitrariness of frontiers and bilingual intelligentsia is poised precariously over diverse monoglot populations. Therefore, he concludes, one can thus think of many of these nations as projects, the achievement of which is still in progress, yet projects conceived more in the spirit of Mazzini than that of Uvarov. He later returns to emphasize again the profoundly modular character of 20th century nationalisms. They can and do, he contends, draw on more than a century and a half of human experience and 3 earlier models of nationalism. Nationalist leaders are thus in a position consciously to deploy civil and military educational systems modeled on official nationalisms, elections, party organizations, and cultural celebrations modeled on the popular nationalisms of 19th century Europe, and the citizen republican idea brought into the world by the Americas. Above all, the very idea of nation is now nestled firmly in virtually all print languages, and nationness is virtually inseparable from political consciousness. As such, he concludes, in a world in which the national state is the overwhelming norm, all of this means that nations can now be imagined without linguistic communality, not in the native spirit of nosotros los americanos, but out of a general awareness of what modern history has demonstrated to be possible. In sum, Anderson theorizes the nation form as a uniquely modern type of imagined community, one imagined as limited and sovereign. He emphasizes the role of a new dominant conception of temporality, homogeneous empty time, in creating the conditions of possibility for the emergence of national consciousness. He further stresses the processes of print capitalism through which the new conception of temporality as synchronicity would be mediated and diffused. Finally, he contends that once the nation form had emerged by the end of the 18th century, it became modular, capable of being transplanted and adapted across a wide variety of political and ideological constellations. And with that, we can take a break.